Hello, everybody, and welcome to Influencing Policy for 2021. I hope everyone is well. I hope everyone is safe. It is strange to starting off the year again in an online capacity with, again, the possibility of face-to-face at some point, but we will talk about that throughout the course. I do want to start by recognizing that the last 12 months have been tough for everybody in some way or another. I want to recognize that we're all tired, that our capacity, I think, sometimes to deal with change and new challenges gets directly affected. The wonderful thing, I think, about social work and social work studies is that it's not only about being able to understand how individual, group, community, and larger societal issues affect everybody, but how they affect us. And we are certainly all affected. I want to also celebrate the fact that you're all here. I said it last year, because I've taught many of you with critical social work with families, that you're here, you're studying, you're adapting, you're persevering, and if that's not the essence of what social work is, I don't know what. So it's about celebrating that we're continuing, that we're adapting. Your learning is continuing. We're also getting better at all of this. I think we're all learning what it means to learn in a remote capacity, but also now combining it with face-to-face. So I do want to start by acknowledging that it has been tough, but it's also important to focus on the here, focus on the now, and acknowledge that this semester is going to be different because it's not going to be all face-to-face, it's not going to be all online, but it's going to be a combination, and that there may be changes. So the ability to adapt, I think, is going to be key. Again, welcome back. I, for one, I'm really glad this is teaching's happening again. I did miss it over the last couple of months. Now I might be alone in this, but I did miss it. It's a wonderful opportunity, I think, at least for me personally, to make sense of what's going on when every week you get a chance to be part of discussions with students. So with that, again, we start a new semester. Many of you are in your final year, so congratulations again, making it this far. And it has been unexpected. It has been not what we all planned, and that's going to continue for the next few weeks. But I think, again, our ability to adapt, our ability to communicate and to deal with this unresolvable, we don't think so going, is the essence of what it means to be a social worker. But it's also, I think, it's important, again, to recognize that is tiring. So with that, week one, we are just getting started. It is about all of us just becoming used to the whole process again. So it is just, week one is just about an introduction, bit of an overview, how we're going to do things this year, and have an opportunity for everyone to catch up. Before going any further, of course, I'd like to pay my respects to traditional owners, and RMIT University acknowledges the people of the Woi Wurrung, Boon Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of the university. RMIT University respectfully acknowledges their ancestors, elders past and present. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And I think, and we'll talk about this as the weeks progress, the way that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have responded to COVID, the fact that there's been, from some reports, no deaths of elders, even though that was the absolute concern, and many of the world's First Nations and Indigenous peoples did not experience that. And that one of the key things and one of the main reasons why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities were able to respond so well to COVID is that for the first time in ever, maybe, that suddenly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities had absolute say over how the response was going to be handled. And I think, and we'll talk about this as the course progresses, especially 1 week. It's a wonderful example of what can happen actually when we apply these principles and let people be able to identify their own needs and not tell them what to do. So we still have so much to learn. Introductions. We taught many of you last semester critical social work with families, and I've taught some of you in other courses throughout the years. So my name is Sebastian, and I'm teaching with Lucy. I'm the lecturer course coordinator, and I'm taking 2 tutes, and Lucy is taking 2 tutes as well. You'll soon receive an invite for the online class. We're doing this through conference, and unfortunately, the way the system works, it means you'll get an invite for all the classes. Just please attend the one that you are allocated to. I am Sebastian Cordova, so I'm a social worker. I've been working in the field on and off for over 20 years. I started in community development and then moved into practice and became a social worker. Initially, I worked in hospitals and schools, at the Children's Hospital doing trauma and bereavement work. But over the last sort of 6 to 8 years, moved into academia and policy. Policy practice is my particular interest in passion. This is why I love this course. I finally get to teach what I absolutely love and believe that is a major contribution of the social work profession. So I teach policy first half of the week, and then the second half of the week I'm a senior policy advisor for the Australian Association of Social Workers, where I sort of do all this work. And I'm also the International Federation of Social Workers United Nations representative, when then I work on behalf of the IFSW as part of the United Nations system, and can talk a little bit about that. Particular interest is that social workers have a wealth of knowledge and ideas to contribute to this policy space, and there's not that many of us around. So this course is a bit of a recruitment tool. I'm also incredibly fortunate again to have Lucy teaching with me. Lucy has again a wealth of knowledge and experience around the tricky and complex combination of mental health policies and then the daily realities of practice. So again, very lucky to have Lucy on board, as that's one of the key themes of this course, is about understanding not just what policy means, but really how, whether you never want to work in policy or are not interested, regardless, it will shape all you do in your direct practice. We'll get to know each other a bit more as the weeks progress, and week 1 will be a little bit more of a kind of sort of get to know and become familiar again with the online space. So the aim of today, it is introduction. It is just to get things going again. It's been quite a few weeks, if not months, since many of us have focused on this. So unless some of you have done maybe other studies, but it really is just about, let's get familiar with all of this and start with the big questions, usually around why are we doing policy? I want to do counselling and group work. Why am I learning about policy? So it's just the big why questions. And then I want to start talking a bit about the how of it all. So how we do all of this and some of the core values around how this is done, and a general definition about what we mean when we say policy practice. But I will talk more about this at the start of next week, because I don't want to overload with knowledge or content. So I'll just talk a little bit about what is policy practice, just so you get the big ideas, and then we'll pick that up next week. So just a bit of a general overview of the course itself. Please visit Canvas and become familiar with it. All that material that you will need for this course is just on Canvas. The PowerPoints are there, the readings are all there. The readings are PDFs. If you're having trouble accessing them, or there are any issues, as I say at the start of every year, if there's any issues related to the quality of the readings, please just email me. We can talk to RMIT and try and arrange it. They should be okay. Most of them are pretty legible. There's no sort of bad photocopy in there. But again, there's whatever your needs are, please let me know, and we can try and work around that and talk to RMIT about what support the library can provide. So what is the course about? This is all from the course guide. Please read it and again go through Canvas to become familiar with it. But in essence, the core is about developing and refining your policy making and policy analysis skills. In the course, you will build on your early policy studies and consider the ways in which social policy is negotiated, formulated, and implemented. So it's kind of assumed that you've done other policy courses, but at the same time, I sort of assume that unless you have an interest in it, it's not the worst thing to refresh and remind the difference between federal and state and how a bill becomes an act and so forth. So So again, assume some knowledge, but if you don't have any knowledge, it's okay. We'll review, and there'll be additional material for you to be able to kind of recap and refresh things you've learned. The course is about exploring contemporary social issues to analyse the policy-making process and understand the points of possible impact. So we want to understand how policy works, and if we're going to influence it and change it, how can we do that, and how can social workers do that? That's basically the focus of the next 12 weeks. Assessments. I'll start talking about that now, just so everyone has a sense of how it all looks, because fundamentally the course has one assessment. It's just one big one that is divided into 3 parts, and it all will culminate in a policy submission, which hopefully, and I really encourage you, you can actually then submit to a real inquiry. So every year we have several students that end up not just submitting their submission, but actually gets picked up. So that means it's published on the website and referenced in the final report. For example, the Royal Commission into Mental Health in Victoria, we had quite a few students who made submissions into the Royal Commission inquiry as part of the course last year and the year before. And several of those have been picked up, and you can just find them on the website. And the final report, it should be forthcoming, and we'll talk about that during the course, and we'll see if it's been referenced. So the assessment is a policy submission, which is the essence. It's the core practice approach that we use in social work. So over the next 12 weeks, you're going to learn about how it all works, but also learn how to develop a policy submission and then complete one. But in order to get to writing and developing and doing a policy submission, the assessments follow the process that I follow in my day-to-day when I do these. So for the ASW, I do about 35 submissions a year. And for the United Nations, it's usually about 5. But this is the process. Assessment 1, which is due in a couple of weeks, but it's very relaxed, reflective piece. Use I statements. You don't have to reference anything, just no spelling mistakes, please. But it's just 300 words, and it's really just a reflective piece. A key question is, what policy issue are you passionate about and why? The whole point of this is that if you'll be able to pick about what area of social policy you want to focus on, and if you're going to write about something, it's good to start from the very start to know why you want to do this. Or for many students, and it happens to most of us at some point, it also gives you a chance to kind of reflect on what policy issue am I actually interested in. Because through the course, you've probably seen a whole range of issues, and it's hard to narrow it down to, well, I want to work on this. And policy submissions just require you to just do one thing at a time. So this is about, if you're going to do an assignment that is a policy submission, what issue do you want to focus on? And let's start with what you're passionate about. 300 words, I statements, personal reflection, and you will be able to use these 300 words in your policy submission. So all the work that you do for assessment 1 and assessment 2, you will be able to use and are expected to use for assessment 3. So you're sort of writing it as you go along. So assessment 1, what are you passionate about and why? Assessment 2 is a scoping document. So anytime we're about to do a submission into any inquiry that ultimately is trying to change some policy or legislation, we got to work out what the situation is. So the scoping document is actually can be in dot point form. There's a template online with headings, but what it is you have to research. So you've identified an issue you're passionate about and something that needs changing. Scoping document is, let's take that step further and go, okay, what's the issue? Who are the key decision makers? Who are the key stakeholder groups? Why is this a problem from a human rights and social justice perspective? Also, what are the solutions? What are you proposing be the change? And then consider, as part of the process, what are some of the barriers to this change? As a scoping document, it's to the point. So that's why it's 1,200 words, dot points, summary of who you're talking about or what you're proposing totally works, because it is where you're basically kind of doing a draft of the submission. Also, at this point with the scoping document is when we can give you feedback and go, yep, this, no, maybe change this, maybe the solution, have you checked this here? So then when you get to assignment 3, you put it all together and you develop your feedback. We will talk about this week by week. We will work on this in class. If you look at, and I'll show you in a second, the course structure, the last 3 weeks of the course are dedicated to how to write a policy submission, and we basically run in-class workshops on how to do this. Only thing you need to focus on really right now, which is the foundation, because if you get this right, then everything else, dare I say it, may be even fun, is what are you passionate about and why? And again, no references, add references, doesn't matter, I statements, but there's a lot out there that's not right. What are you passionate about? And away you go. So just think about that one, but we'll talk about it more in class. Bit of an overview. All of this is on Canvas about how the 12 weeks run. So we start with general introduction, and then we start looking at the process initially. So what's the context of policy? We look at things like agenda setting, how policy gets developed. And then at week 6, what we'll do. Normally at week 6 for this course, we attended a rally. So we usually attended the Palm Sunday Refugee Rally, and we would go as a class. We may do that again. It just depends on what's happening. Also, if you can't attend, you can just watch it streaming. They were streaming it way before COVID, so people could attend. But if not, for whatever reason, we can also dedicate week 6 to running a workshop. So I'll dedicate that whole week to doing the scoping assignment section. Then we'll continue looking at basically how policy gets developed and created. And then the last 3 weeks are submission workshops, where in class every week, the lecture and the readings focus on how to develop a submission, how to write a submission, and all the different dimensions of it. About language use, about the use of evidence, examples. And as you'll see when we start next week, the tutorials are structured based in a particular way, and each week has a particular topic, but it follows the same structure, where what you're doing fundamentally each week in a small kind of way is replicating the kind of work you'll be doing for the assignment. So every week will be on a smaller scale, doing a scoping and kind of submission for child protection. You don't have to, like child protection for week 1, you don't have to write it, but it's about having those discussions. So by the time we get to week 12, you would have actually sort of discussed how would you do a submission, how would you do policy practice around a range of issues. And as you can see, we try and cover a range of issues so you are familiar with a bunch of policy issues. But at this stage, this will all make sense as the course progresses. Really, the only thing you have to start thinking about is what policy issue you're passionate about and why. Still have a bit of time to submit that. That's the only thing. And we'll talk more and more about the assessments as the weeks progress. And as you can see, working on the assessments is actually incorporated into the course, because the assessment is, again, the further defining and developing a core policy practice skill, which is submission writing. All right, so for this week, really, we're just getting into it. I just really wanted to provide a bit of an overview of what this is all about and why policy. Now, policy always, for social work, it tends to sort of be tacked on at the end with research, like that kind of part of social work practice that people think that they should do, but they don't know what it is, and they didn't get into social work to do policy or research, but it sort of sounds good when you sort of tack it on at the end. But the point, I think, is that for many of us, that we identify social work policy practice as its own distinct form of social work practice. So you've got individual work, you've got group work, you've got community work, you've got crisis work, you've got natural disaster recovery work, you can also be a researcher, and you can do policy practice. So a distinct form of work which takes the skills, knowledge of social work approaches and then applies it to the space of policy. So that's what we're talking about. Now, there's obviously nowhere near as many social workers in policy practice as there are in direct practice. And I guess so the whole point of this is that it's by no means that the idea of policy practice new. It's actually quite a few decades old, but it's this idea of social workers. We not only work with individuals, we also need to work with systems and structures. And one of the ways we can do that is through policy. First question, and it comes up all the time. Now, I did this very course when I did my bachelor's at RMIT, like in 2009, and Catherine McDonald and John White, who were teaching it at the time, by the end of the 12 weeks, like the final in-class discussion was we just had to get up on the spot and define what policy was. And that was cruel because we all got caught up. we all got, well, couldn't do it, like laws or something. I know. So I want to start with what is policy from the start. Best way to think about it is policy is everywhere. Policy affects everything you do. From the moment you wake up to the moment that you go to sleep, there is some policy that's determining the scope of your action. Let's go day by day. You wake up. The time you wake up is determined by some policy, because you're waking up usually in relation to some place you have to be. Whether it's a workplace, well, that's 9 a.m., 9 to 5 are agreed upon work hours based on policies around the working day. You have to wake up at a certain time in relation to university studies, for example. That is all very much based on policies from the university about what time and hours they can provide classes. Let alone that the fact that you're probably watching this from your home, based on RMIT policies. So just when you wake up, automatically, already, usually it's in relation to something else that is determined by some policy about how we should run this. Next thing you probably do is you wake up, and as many of us do, check your phone. Anything that's on your phone, and especially now with what's going on with Facebook, is if anyone's still on Facebook, is that what you see and what you do on your phone is completely governed by policies, and more specifically legislation like the Telecommunications Act, which is completely governing and determining what you can see, what you can't see, what you can communicate and what you can't communicate. Go to the bathroom. Water usage. There's Environment Protection Acts that determine what you can and can't flush. We've had policies during droughts around how long you can have a shower for, how long you can brush your teeth for. So already, like basic couple of steps, it's all been guided by policies. And this is sort of on a minute day-to-day level. Getting dressed. Now, this isn't the 1920s where, like a bare ankle would cause like police presence. But there's I think it's called the Summary Offences Act, which actually is legislation that's not actively enforced, but it's about what you can wear in public. So that there are legislations actually about what is, and policies broadly around what is suitable attire. So when you're getting dressed, and then let alone that in some workplaces, for example, there's policies about what you can and can't wear. Some workplaces have requirements, whether you can go whether you have to go in suit or business formal and that kind of stuff. So how you're getting dressed already, again, being determined by some policies. Let alone you get in public transport, a car. As a student, you are, why do lectures go for an hour? Why is it a 12-week calendar kind of course structure? Why are courses arranged at a certain level? Why is it written assignments? All of this is by TEQSA, which is sort of a big organisation and policies and legislation that governs all of this. So policies everywhere, everything you do ultimately is being governed or directed by some kind of policy on some level. Policies are fundamentally about people. It's about how, as a collective, we run society. Policies can be incredibly good. They can afford people rights. Policies and legislations as a form of policy allows people at least the right of recourse, that if you're walking down the street, in theory, someone can't just come up to you and throw something at you. And if they do, you have a right of justice. Now, again, in theory, in practice, all a bit more complicated. It means that there's consistency. It means that, for example, that there are policies related to how assessments are graded, and that if you feel as though it's been unfair, that there are policies that allow you rights to pursue that further. Policies can be incredibly liberating. They can afford rights to a lot of people. They can also be incredibly oppressive. We have policies to this day that determine who is an Australian and who isn't, basically, and given two different status around their humanity. So a child who's Australian afforded a whole range of rights, as long as they're under 10, because we Australia, and we'll talk about this later, and I think we did in critical social work with families, that Australia has one of the lowest stages in the world of criminal responsibility, meaning children as young as 10, and they can be incarcerated. But what it means is that fundamentally, like if you're an Australian child, you're afforded universal healthcare, education. If you are a non-Australian child and are in Australia, then Australian government's totally cool with imprisoning you in Broadmeadows, basically, in the what are they calling it now, like interim accommodation centre. But again, that's the difference between whether state-sanctioned child torture is allowed or not, and that is policy. So policy affects the people on every level. Another huge thing about policy is the allocation of resources. Policy is how government determines who gets what. And that has dramatic changes and dramatic influences on how we run society. Who gets tax breaks? Who gets support? Who doesn't? Those are policies. So they can affect your minute decisions in terms of how you get dressed or what time you wake up, to how we run society as a whole or what issues we focus on. So why? Because it's everywhere and it's really important. Normally, and it happens every year, and rightly so, because it is a bit of a contested issue, as with all things social work, because there's all some interpretations and debate. What is policy and what isn't policy can cause a lot of headaches. I don't encourage this for assignments, but I go back to the Australian Concise Oxford Dictionary because I do think it provides a solid summary, which is policy is a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by a government, party, business, or individual. Policies can happen at every level. You might have a policy in your own home around who packs up after dinner. That's a policy. That's fine. Now, the consequences of that policy may be significant in the home, but ultimately they won't lead to prison time. Policies, for example, from a federal level that manifest themselves in legislation affect millions of people and can have pretty dire consequences if you do not follow those. So policies are at every possible level. As social workers, we sort of start getting particularly interested in the policies at a federal or state level, particularly through legislation, because those policies have the ability to deprive people of their freedom, of their basic human rights, or afford them their basic human rights. So you will hear policies being referenced to everything and anything, and it is that general. But again, our interest lies, and we will look at this as the weeks progress, our interest lies in what is the scope of influence of these policies, and that's where we go. That's where we start becoming particularly interested, because again, it has the capacity to impact the lives of millions of people. So anything from a federal government, for example, that states a course or principle of action is a policy. Sometimes policies can be a media release, and that's still a policy. But until it becomes legislation, then it doesn't necessarily have the full force of the power that it has. So that's policy, course or principle of action. Policies happen at every level. We are interested particularly in the ones that can impact the most amount of people, and the ones like legislations that have significant power to either oppress or support people. Why do we do policy? Good to go back sort of to the critical traditions, really, as a profession, and we've talked about this throughout the degree, and you would have seen it in critical approaches. That one thing that defines a profession is an ethical responsibility to challenge oppressive social structures. Now, social structures, at least when I was studying, I was like, yeah, social structures. But what are they? Like, are they? Because I know where they manifest themselves, like in everyday practices. But then, how do we change them? And so, sometimes it can be, because also social structures, depends what approach you use, can be discourses, and then they can manifest themselves in different forms. And that can be sometimes challenging because it's everywhere. How do you change a culture? One of the things that we certainly know that social structures manifest themselves is social policy. So that gives us something a little bit more tangible to focus on from a social work perspective, where we go, okay, a social structure can be cultural, can be economic, but it certainly manifests itself in social policy. And if you change a social policy, you can be on your way to starting to change those social structures. And a lot of the time, it's massive changes in social policy that started changing certain social structures. The 8-hour working day, for example, was in Melbourne in the 1850s, was a significant change in social policy and legislation that started sort of changing the social structures that did not really recognise the rights of the workers, and so on and so on and so on. We, in this course, and even in your assignments, I recommend we look fundamentally at state and federal legislation and its implementation for the reasons that I said before, is that it is state and federal legislation as a form of policy that has the ability to influence the largest number of people, and that the omission of a word in legislation can have, devastating impacts for so many. So that's what we focus on, because it's not the only source of social structures, but it's a tangible, and it's a bit more of a direct sense, and it's one of the forms of macro social work practice. There are many others, but it's one, again, that gives for many of us, gives us a bit of a clear path around. All right, let's go after that. Also, social policy is central to social work. Every tradition of social work recognizes that you need to understand the context in which social work and the people you're working with exist and occupy. Because, as it says in Code of Ethics and the readings this week, society is often the, if not the, source of individual and collective distress. So if we don't understand social policy, then we're not necessarily going to understand the context. And I'll talk about next week, when I say social policy, what I mean. There is a classification, but really it's policies related to the social. But I'll talk about that more next week. It is usually through actually the policy process that social problems are framed and created. Again, the idea of the critical spirit to understanding social policy is that it is through the social policy and the policy creation, when people create laws and create policies to prevent or allow certain things, is how problems are understood. A long-standing example is, just think about the amount of money and funding and attention and focus that something like terrorism has received, which, and we'll look at this, which in the last 10 years in Australia has killed about 8 people, as opposed to violence against women, which there are some pretty solid arguments out there saying that it is certainly a form of terrorism as well. Yet the level of action or government interest is nowhere near the same. Now, why is that? Because, again, it's how problems are framed and constructed and understood. Another key reason is, even if you never want to talk about social policy or focus on policy, is that at the end of the day, social workers, many of them, if not a vast majority, are employed by the state, and it is their job to carry out those policies. In many cases, it can be policies in relation to mental health support and bushfire recovery, for example, that we're still dealing with from last year. But it can also be the enforcement of the cashless welfare card, which the latest draft of legislation actually proposes that social workers be responsible for assessing whether someone receives one or doesn't. And we'll focus on this in week 2. So whether you're interested in policy or not, whatever role you take, you will be charged with the implementation of this policy, and you will be the sort of the face of it in many cases. So really important to know and understand. And again, policy shapes all aspects of social work practice. It defines who you are as a professional as well, and it certainly shapes all the people we work with. So really important to kind of understand basically the rules of the game, because it's through these policies and legislations that these massive decisions about how we run things are determined. I'm not going to go into this too much right now, but I'll just touch on it now, and then there's a video here. I do recommend you can watch it, because again, even if you never want to hear about policy again, really important to understand not just the historical, but the current practices where social workers are tasked with carrying out these policies, and sometimes very oppressive and very horrible policies. So social workers have historically, and to this day, if you look at the overrepresentation of Aboriginal children being removed from their families, have been responsible for the implementation of some of the most oppressive and discriminatory policies. I do encourage you, so the Four Corners episode is about forced adoptions. Currently, at the moment, there's a Victorian inquiry into forced adoptions and what happened at the women's hospital, so very close to RMIT, where, as you see from the video, social workers were very much part of these processes. Now, I think also the video kind of highlights the complexity of all of this, but also that social workers themselves were also being sort of directed by, usually, if not almost in every case in the 60s and 70s, male doctors. So it's not as straightforward as social workers were evil. There was like other stuff that was happening at the same time. It's important to reflect on and deconstruct. But the reality is that social workers who in the 60s and 70s, in this case, who you'll see interviewed, had the same qualifications as you, same values, human rights and social justice, and then found themselves carrying out these policies. This is why it's really important to understand the historical and contemporary links between social policy and social work practice. And again, how the legislation and policies that are running and determining how we do things are shaping what you do in your day-to-day. The essence of critical reflection is to understand what is happening and how policy shapes you, but, and here's the critical part, how you can shape policy. Because that's the flip side to it. I do recommend, if you can, watch this. It's from a couple of years ago, but still relevant today. And as I said before, government's still dealing with the consequences of forced adoption practices. And there's a current inquiry into forced adoptions that if any of you want to do a submission to, we just did one with the Victorian branch and with Alex Patel actually before last year. So if any of you are interested, it's a particularly important issue because, again, the consequences are still being felt to this day. Big questions for reflection about why policy is how can social workers in direct practice advocate for system and policy reform? So if you are tasked with carrying out these policies, how easy it is for you then to go against the system that you're part of. Now you can, but it's also a challenge because you're basically going against your employer. Like that's not easy at the best of times, but you have an ethical responsibility to. Question then is, which social workers might have the capacity to engage in policy work around these issues? And what could they do? And this is the essence of what we're getting at. It's, again, this idea that we need people in direct practice, but sometimes that the structural change that is needed can be very difficult for people in direct practice to do. Hence, social work policy practice that tends to be outside of government, tends to be funded by organisations that are not responsible with carrying out these policies, and therefore gives you a level of independence. So that's kind of why policy practice. I did, as we get the course going, just want to refresh some of the how we do all of this. And what I kind of stress is that the values that we bring to all of this policy work is what distinguishes social work policy practice from other traditions. There are many people doing policy work. There are Bachelor of Social Policy, there's Masters of Policy, Bachelor of Public Policy, Health Policy. Like there's a million different policy degrees. But there is something unique about the combination of social workers doing policy practice. And a lot of it is the values that we bring and the perspectives that we bring. So I just wanted to talk about that. Three big ones. And again, I'm not going to sort of just go through slides. You've gone through them. I do like a decent quote, so I'm just sort of going to flag big three, really, which is what we bring to policy practice: social justice, human rights, and the critical tradition. And just a couple of quotes that I think capture well these ideas. So social justice, a quote from Sarah Grimke, who was an abolitionist in the 1830s, is, "I ask no favours for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they take their feet from off our necks." Human rights from Robert Jones Sr., who's on Twitter, has published a couple of books recently. "We can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist." And the critical tradition, which is the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. That is Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons. I think that's a Thomas Jefferson quote, but that's where I heard that quote. And I think as I shared with some of you last year around, I was born into a military dictatorship. So the fragileness of our current state of things is never lost on me, and never lost on many of us, and not lost, I'm sure, on many of you in class. And the idea of the price of freedom being eternal vigilance is just a reminder that every day we all get up and we construct, and some people are out there making the world a better place, and some people are out there making things horrible. Like if suddenly everyone just stops doing, if there were no people, there'd be no structural discrimination. So people are actively constructing this every day. It's also within people's power then to stop actively treating other human beings horribly. But what it means is that every day brings the opportunities for change and the opportunities for action, but also the possibilities for going back. And I always I like to reflect that really, like, how old is democracy in Australia? Australian democracy, really, if you're going to go by democratic standards, started at some point between 1962 and 1965, when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were afforded the right to vote. Not 67 referendum, that was something else. That wasn't the right to vote. So that means that Australian democracy is 50 years old at best, let alone other countries when you look at it globally. So because you can't consider a country democratic that wasn't inclusive of all its people. Like, that fails by its own definition. So that really means that ultimately this whole thing that people should be able to vote for elected members and have some say in how they do this is, compared to the 100,000 years that we ran things differently, is new. And it requires, again, daily pursuit, daily action, and the absence of clear victories. Because, I think sometimes that's people sometimes, when they view this from the outside and aren't involved, kind of want to see we did it, hooray. It doesn't work that way. It's like, we did it, marriage equality. No, gee, like, the process itself was traumatic, let alone everything else that happened and will happen. It's not resolved. Like what's happening now. We got rid of Trump. We did it. It's a win for fascism. Is it? Because that system, whoever's in charge, is pretty fascist. So maybe less fascist, and certainly we're not going, certainly better, but how much? So, eternal vigilance every day. I talked about this in critical reflection, in critical social work of families, and it is just a sort of summary of how kind of a basic approach that I apply to policy work. And I think it's important when you work through policy, because policy, when you're trying to learn, ultimately it's about learning what people have tried, failed in, because if they did it successfully, you wouldn't be worrying about it as an issue, and then proposing your own way. And I think, as I've discussed in other courses, I think social workers get caught up in number two, and we sort of need all three. So the idea, this is the process, anytime you see a new policy, anytime you learn about something new, about what has been tried, to try and sort of follow these three steps, which is step one, inherit respectfully. People have tried things in the past around your policies. People have also been advocating for years. And understand the barriers, understand the challenges. A lot of the time, there were unintended consequences. Sometimes there were intended consequences. But it's about understand the history, but also assume that like, by and large, people possibly didn't set out or allow the possibility that people didn't set out just to develop these horrible policies. NDIS, I find, is a fine example. Now, my son's an NDIS participant, so we have direct experience with seeing how that works and how that doesn't. And from the policy perspective, we've been part of it through the ASW since its development. And you can see good ideas in there, people tried, and then it got complicated with whatever it is we got now. Step two, deconstruct critically. This is what social workers do really well. Tear it apart. What doesn't work? This policy is horrible because A, B, and C. Hate it. Horrible. Step three, which is what's always missing, and this is the part that's missing from most policy work, and you will see this from submissions. This is the difference between a good submission and a bad submission. Is, all right, you know the problems. You've also inherited respectfully, so you know the history a little bit. So what have they tried? What are you proposing? What's your solution? How can you take those learnings of the past, identify its limitations, and what are you proposing be the change? That's what's always missing, because we can certainly get out there and critique what's not working, but what's missing from all of this? So keep that in mind. That's what your submissions are about, and that is the missing part of all of this. Transform creatively, bring something to the table. Don't just be another person saying what's not working with something, but propose changes, and that's a really important part of all of this. I do want to encourage, if you have these around, actually try and find them again. They will prove to be quite useful. Now, we're not going to necessarily every week we'll be able to engage with critical theory in some way, but because again, policy practice is inherently informed by a critical tradition, not the worst thing to go back to recognize, to look at why we do it, which again is just the core tenets of critical social work, which is that large social processes absolutely shape the lives of everybody. So we need to understand those social processes. It also gives a way of how we do policy practice, which is about working with and in collaboration with people. And this is why, for example, in your scoping document, knowing who the key stakeholders are is such an important part, because it's not about what you think needs to happen with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. Because if your submission, and this happens a lot in practice, if the submission is, I think Aboriginal children should blah, 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 it really kind of goes against the essence of what a critical human rights perspective is. Well, what are Aboriginal communities, peak groups saying? So keep that in mind for your assignment, that now you're not going to be able to call these groups directly, but you can certainly find position papers, statements, and solutions that the communities that are directly affected by all of this have been proposing for, I would argue, decades, but no one's listening to. So just find those books, but at some point, no urgency. Another key thing which we'll do throughout the course is about defamiliarizing the familiar, which is, and we saw this in critical social work with families as well, which is just ask, I like the asking questions no one can remember asking. So why is, why do you get 10, now 20 mental health sessions through Medicare? What's that based on? Why is 18 the age that you become an adult? Why is 10, again, the age of criminal responsibility? So this is the wonder of defamiliarizing policy, is that a lot of policy and a lot of things that we do, we just do because we've been doing them. And someone thought of it at some point and went, sure, okay, this. And then it just continued. And it's easier just to continue doing a bad thing, it seems, than doing a better thing. So this is really kind of the essence of what we bring, is challenging. Why are we doing it that way? Aren't there other ways of doing this? So keep that in mind. Just one more point, and then I'll sort of briefly touch on what I'll talk about next week, but just to kind of wrap up. I do want to talk about the importance of policy practice and self-care for this course, but also policy practice more broadly. When we talk about self-care, we always tend to focus more on direct practice, because you're sort of with humans present, and it can be quite distressing sometimes, and it can be very challenging for many reasons, very rewarding, but also very challenging. So it doesn't really get policy. Practice doesn't get much focus, because a lot of the times you sort of, you might be in front of a computer, or you might be attending a hearing, and so on and so on. It is very challenging when your job or your work, or even for this course, is to understand how horrible the world can be to not one or two, thousands, if not millions of people. And it's sometimes to the point where it can be overwhelming to see. Like, part of my job is going through coroner's reports at the ASW, because we need to know how the child protection system failed children who died. These are horribly distressing documents to read. You're not going to have to read them in the course, but this can be part of the work you do. And one of the things about social policy or policy practice is we don't tend to focus on things that are working well. So if it's working well, good on you, great. But if it's not, that's where we're at. And if it's of interest to policy practice, as we would have seen, it means it's thousands, if not millions of people. Now, once or twice here or there, it's okay. But for many of us, and as you'll see also in this course as we do it week to week, it's a day-to-day thing, and that can be a lot. It can also sneak up on you. Like it still happens. I've been doing this for years, and it still happens to me that every so often I just get up and start reading or seeing something, and for me, because of our kids, I think it's with children, and if I see anything about children, that seems to, like, I can find myself in tears at kind of work, and I kind of think, okay, I'm identifying with this a little bit too closely, and I need to have a moment, because obviously this is getting a bit too much for me. But I mean, any circumstance, you have to experience a level of empathy, otherwise what would you do it? But it's empathy that you can manage, and that doesn't get to the point where it can be so overwhelming that it's difficult to do this. So every week for this course, we're going to be looking at a different social issue and looking at the experiences of people and trying to bring in their voices into the classroom through videos and other sources. So just self-care strategies from the start. Whatever it is that you've been doing so far, keep that in mind. Breaks as much as possible. Also, the fact that many of you will be learning from your home. And again, that space and your experience within the space can certainly shape that space, so that if your association with a space is how you're reading report after report of how horrible the world can be, it can make the home, which needs to be, I guess, a far more supportive space, be associated with some, pretty horrible policies and practices. So just keep that in mind. You know yourselves best, but be aware again that while you may not be working with clients directly, you're certainly dealing with human experience and suffering on a mass scale, and it's impossible for that not to affect you or everyone on some level. So just keep that in mind from the start. Last thing to wrap up, because even online, I'm following my proud tradition of, for some reason during the summer kind of break, I lose all sense of time management, and I don't know how long things go for. I will talk about this next week, but I want to finish off, and I've touched on a few things so far, but what is social work policy practice? Social work policy practice, as you see from the readings, are activities undertaken by social workers as an integral part of their professional activity in diverse fields, types of practice that focus on the formulation and implementation of new policies, as well on existing policies and suggesting changes on them. So these activities seek to further policies on the organisational, local, national and international levels that are in accord with social work values. You take your social work values, social work skills and apply them to policies, and it can be within government or outside of government. It's okay if this doesn't make total sense now. The whole point is over the next 12 weeks, you will do social work policy practice. You will finish with the best possible evidence of what social work policy practice is, which is a submission. So hopefully it'll make sense by doing. Policy practice is its own form of practice, different to a whole range of others. And you may do sometimes policy work as part of your direct practice role, but it's also a distinct role in and of itself. Also understood as social advocacy. There's a point in the readings which I think sometimes I read and I think the Vice Guy could have been a little bit more clear on that, but it's about the role of the service user in quotation marks in the protest tends to be a major difference between policy practice and social advocacy in the field, because it depends on the organisation. But just to stress that all policy practice involves user, client, consumer, patient, participant involvement to some degree. Just how much is the question? Because if you're doing policy practice as part of community development, then a lot of the time that you have to completely engage with that community, and that work needs to really be collaborative. If you're working for a professional association that's representative in nature, then by its essence, people are paying their fees, like with a union, for you to represent their views. So you have to consult with them, but in any representative role, you also have a bit more autonomy around making a judgment about how you construct that argument. So all forms of policy practice work with people, it's just how much and to what level, and that sometimes changes on the role and changes on the organisation, really. But it does raise some major ethical challenges, which happens all the time with social work, for example, which is what if you consult member consultation and you get pretty horrible homophobic, transphobic, climate denier, anti-vaxxer views, and you sort of go, like, what do we do? So, and that happens just because you've got a social work degree doesn't mean you're necessarily all of those things. So, challenges, and part of what makes policy practice interesting, and that takes up most of my work, trying to reconcile differences. But even things like, for example, we're now dealing with coercive control in the legislation they're trying to pass to criminalise coercive control, and the sector, the family violence sector, is torn as to whether to criminalise or not criminalise coercive control. Now, everyone agrees that it should be illegal, but there's different understandings about how that legislation would look and could you do it in the current system. So major ethical challenges, and part of then the work is, as a policy practitioner, is to try and find some middle ground that you're saying something. So just keep it in mind, it does change from place to place. It's just some forms of policy practice are deeply involved with the community. Others, it's more representational. So it is your role sometimes to find a position amongst a lot of views. I want to talk about more about this next week, but there's a big difference between policy development within government, where you're actually writing, for example, the COVID response policies, and policy outside of government, where you're basically telling the Andrews government that some of their COVID policies are deeply racist and horrible, especially how the Victoria government has treated people in the housing towers. Of all people, Richard Wynne, who's the housing minister, who is a social worker. Similar skills for both, though, which is what you bring as social workers, and also similar to direct practice skills as well, which is assessment analysis, which is what you do at the moment, understanding, development and implementation, and then advocacy as well, where you're trying to change. I'm going to talk about more of this about next week, so don't worry about it for now, but I'll recap and elaborate this further, but that you can work within government, but then again, think about it. If you wanted to do climate change, that if you wanted to work climate change within government, basically your boss would be Scott Morrison. So how much could you actually do within that space? And then outside of government, which I'll talk about next week, it's a whole range of different groups and associations, some representing professions, other representing lived experience groups, and all trying to advocate. But again, I'll recap this next week. But just keep in mind, there's two ways to go about this usually. If you're within government, you've got the key decision makers at your grasp, but how much could you actually influence? And then outside of government, you have more independence, but then you can just be dismissed as just being kind of noise. So the challenges. In terms of what we actually do, and I thought just end it with a bit more of a clarity around what this actually means in the day-to-day. Really, there's kind of four big approaches and four things that we do when we do policy practice. Submissions, so that's the government's constantly pushing through legislation or inquiries, and as part of the process, the public can have a say, and this is where we go in and make submissions, do public hearings, as you can see in some of the photos there, where we're called up to meet with government and say our statements and take questions and get into fiery debates sometimes. We also meet with ministers, which is where you write to health ministers and other ministers and try and change their views. A lot of media work, so media releases, getting articles in and opinion pieces. So that's where we sort of try and change the cultural view. And then direct action, which is a lot easier pre-COVID, which is getting the banners out and going into rallies. To sum up, so again, intro, a few things to get your head around. I will review and recap all of this next week to its purest essence, but important to key things to start. At least you know why we do policy, some of the how around it all more broadly, and also kind of what it means to do policy practice. But key thing throughout bringing it all together is that to become an effective policy practitioner, it's about developing a vision. It's about what your values are, hence assessment one. Also, what are you passionate about? What's your theory of social change? How you want things to happen? Looking for opportunities for advocacy. You're trying to change people's views, and that's not easy, and it's not straightforward. And even though people have written textbooks and charts to show how this all could work, and we will see this as the weeks progress, In practice, it's you got to find the opportunities and be creative and adapt. It's about taking risks, but sensible risks. There's an inherent challenge of that as well. The flexibility versus planning, because you got to plan, but at the same time, like the policy, as you hopefully will see over the next 2 weeks, you think something's going to be big news and then it isn't. A lot of things happen out of nowhere that then suddenly front and center in terms of the agenda setting, and there's a lot of unexpected things that happen. COVID was, is a fine example. It's about being also assertive and respectful. This is where policy work is a lot different to academic or research or even just uni assignment writing, because you have to be more assertive. It's not around saying that there are all these different views. It's like, no, you have to stand for something and you have to communicate in a passionate way, and we'll look at that. Multiple skills, but I think this is where social workers come in it, because social workers can work with a range of different backgrounds, work across different communities, and also work with individuals and large-scale groups. Again, as with social work, it's about tolerating uncertainty, and that you don't know where things are going to go, and there's only so much you can plan. And this is where the key thing is. It's about being persistent, and that social change can be very slow. And from the start, as a final kind of thought, I'm just going to ask you to reflect. In your lifetime, you have seen great social progress. For example, in 1997, it was illegal to be gay in Tasmania. There was legislation against homosexuality, I think is the term in the legislation. And then by 2017, there was marriage equality. Now, has that solved everything? By no means, but there is certainly progress in 20 years. Now, how did that happen? And obviously, from that period, over those sort of 2 decades of advocacy, was in relation to, directly linked to then advocacy that was happening for decades before. From CAMP, ACT UP, and a whole range of other advocacy groups that have been working in Australia for decades before that. So social change can happen, but again, there rarely is a clear defining victory, but there's certainly progress. But how did that progress occur? Was it a single act? Was it everyday small acts? What we certainly do know is that persistence is key, because it can be slow. It can be very fast as well, but it also can be slow. And that's, I think, sometimes where ethically it can become challenging, because no single submission will solve all of this. No single rally, no single media release. So it's about sticking with it, and that things can and do get better, but it takes work. All right, week 1. See everyone at the Toots. Please email me if you have any questions. Do the readings. Week 1, we'll just all become familiar with the online teaching space, welcoming any new people who are not familiar with the online conferencing space. Say hello and establish group norms and so forth. If you have any questions, please either pop it in the discussion forum or send me an email. Otherwise, welcome back. Take care. Looking forward to meeting everyone, and speak soon. Bye, everyone.